Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's workshop on thinking in systems. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, New Zealand, and the world, and to recognise their continuing connection to the land and the waters within and around it. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging who hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and the hopes of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and Maori peoples in particular. I'd also like to acknowledge the deep wisdom that First Nations people hold in respect of the ideas which we'll be exploring today. Systems and complexity sit at the core of Indigenous peoples' values, knowledge systems and way of life. To quote from a paper by Amberlin and Blaise Quaimulina, in Aboriginal philosophy, the universe is a pattern comprised of other patterns, of systems inside systems. Nothing exists in isolation. All life exists in relationship to everything else. Today's workshop, as you all know, is about thinking in systems. We're starting in this main room, hearing from 5 thought leaders about what systems thinking means and looks like in government. We're then breaking into smaller conversations, each of which is going to be hosted by one of our thought leaders to dive more deeply into the conversation, the challenges, the opportunities, and the very unique moment in time which we're all currently experiencing. We're going to be recording the parts of this session that are in the main room and live tweeting as we go. If you want to contribute to the Twitter conversation, you can use the hashtag ReimagineGov and/or GovAftershock. We're not going to be recording the breakout rooms, and that's because we want these to be safe and open spaces for you to ask the questions that you want to ask and have the conversations that you want to have. And we ask, in light of that, that you will respect Chatham House rules with respect to anything that's said in the context of the breakout rooms. So why are we having this conversation today? The COVID pandemic has revealed in the starkest of terms the interconnectedness of many things. It's shown how a virus which affects the human respiratory system can bring the global economy to its knees. The COVID response has demanded a new, more collaborative form of government and has revealed the inadequacy of linear, siloed and reductionist approaches in a complex world. So today, as part of the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation Government After the Shock series, we're exploring the idea of systems thinking as a new model for government. This model requires more than just new ways of doing government. It requires new ways of being. For governments, thinking in systems means new ways of seeing and understanding the role that they play in the world and in society. Thinking in systems is core to the Centre for Public Impact's vision for reimagining government. It means thinking in terms of diverse perspectives, in terms of relationships and dynamics. It means shifting away from approaches which focus on solving problems to approaches that are rooted in constant learning and adaptation. And I'd now like to just share a very short video which sets out CPI's vision in more detail. Carmela, can you hit play, please?
Over the past decade, the relationship between people and government has become increasingly frayed. A series of global shocks have shaken citizens' trust in their government's ability to adapt to meet their changing needs, and the power to drive change continues to rest in the hands of relatively few. In 2020, the COVID-19 crisis has brought into sharp focus the need for government to work differently. Until now, much of the debate around government and public service reform is about what government should do, how services should be structured, how performance should be tracked, or how decisions should be made. However, the damaged relationship between government and citizens is proof that not enough emphasis has been placed to date on how government should be, the beliefs and principles that drive government action. But there is hope. Changemakers at different levels of government and in frontline public services around the world are pioneering a new vision for government based on 3 core beliefs. First, that most of the challenges we face as a society are complex in nature. Second, that the quality of human relationships matters a great deal. And third, that progress is best achieved through experimentation and a process of continuous learning. These beliefs have given rise to a new set of values and principles that serve as a useful guide for the future of government, particularly as leaders are grappling with how to rebuild a post-COVID society. They call on government leaders to think systematically but act locally, share power with those best placed to act, challenge unnecessary hierarchy and collaborate across boundaries, seek out strengths and build on them, champion the voices of those who are heard the least, and optimise for learning rather than control. While the disconnect between government and people has been growing for some time, the COVID-19 recovery presents a powerful opportunity for us to close that gap and reimagine government so that it works for everyone. Are you part of the growing movement to reimagine government? Join the conversation.
So there's certainly a zeitgeist around thinking in systems at the moment. And so what we wanted to do today was not spend a lot of time telling you more about it. Instead, we really wanted this to be an opportunity to hear briefly from our thought leaders, but then dedicate the majority of this session to a discussion, a really interactive conversation where you'll be able to explore and discuss what systems thinking means and looks like in your work. And we're going to be asking you to consider 3 questions. In order to think more systemically in government, what do we need to keep doing, believing, or being? What do we need to leave behind? And what do we need to start doing, believing, or being? And these questions are being explored by different conversations across the globe over the next 48 hours as part of the OPSI Government Aftershock series. So I'd now like to briefly introduce our 5 thought leaders, and I'm then going to invite them each to speak for just a few minutes on a particular question that I'm going to ask them. Today we have Shauna Davidson joining us from the Systems School. Shauna trained as an academic but is a practitioner at heart. Shauna has been building capacity for systems thinking across Australia for 5 years. Her approach translates concepts to practice. And Shauna makes system thinking, and I can speak to this firsthand, accessible and valuable on the ground in everyday workspaces. Angie Tanare was born in Papakura, I mispronounced that, Papakura, and raised in South Auckland with a whakapapa to Ngāti Poro on her father's side and Pakena from Taranaki on her mother's side. Angie is the Southern Initiative's social entrepreneur and grounds her work with communities in South Auckland in a deliberate and quite exceptional blending of Indigenous design and systems thinking approaches. Misha is an Assistant Commissioner at the Australian Tax Office. Misha joined the ATO in August last year and is driving a shift towards a transdisciplinary approach that integrates system thinking, design, and behavioural insights in order to more effectively support the ATO and government in understanding and responding to complex challenges. We've also got with us Ray Ison. Ray has been a professor of systems at the UK Open University since 1994, well before many people were even talking about systems or systems thinking. And Ray at the Open University has developed an international standing in systems scholarship and made significant contributions through his research, teaching, and consultancy. Ray has recently published a fantastic book called The Hidden Power of Systems Thinking, Governance in a Climate Emergency. And the book touches on a lot of the issues that we're going to be speaking about today. And last but not least, Sam Wright. Sam has spent the best part of 15 years focusing his energy on for-purpose work, from sustainability to food systems, youth wellbeing, and environmental conservation. At the heart of Sam's work is a complexity practice, which Sam describes as working with people to understand the landscape that they operate in and how to adapt and move towards preferable futures. Since July 2019, Sam has been working with conservation volunteers across Australia and New Zealand. So you'll see we've really got an incredible mix of experts who practice system thinking in different ways and across different fields. And I'm now going to ask each of our speakers to answer a very big question in very little time. And really what this is supposed to be is a provocation and a stimulation and a thought starter for the conversations that you'll be having in the breakout rooms. It's by no means a comprehensive answer to the very large question that I'll be asking. So Shauna, we're going to start with you, and I'm going to ask you to share, what does it mean for government to think in systems?
Thanks, Thea. Not uncomfortable to be the first one to go whatsoever, or for this very big question. When Thea posed this to me, as I often do, I put a question back rather than an answer. And the first thing that I asked her was, well, are we talking about how might government think in systems? Emphasis on that concept, those theories, paying attention to boundaries, perspectives, relationships, and dynamics, that aspect of the complex adaptive system, emergence, uncertainty, all of those big principles that we need to kind of be giving attention to. Or was it about what does it mean for government to think in systems? Emphasis on government as a specific actor in the system. And from the work that I do and from my experience, I think that the emphasis is on the latter, on government as a role, as a specific actor in the system. And why that's so important, I think, is because recognizing the role that each of us have, that each of us play, it's often one of the most uncomfortable aspects of thinking in systems, which is that the system is not outside and beyond us, that our actions are not disconnected from the things situated around us. And that's particularly true for government, where oftentimes their perceived role, a kind of mental model of their contribution is as rule maker, and yet they are, of course, so much more deeply embedded in the system. And so I think that that is the suggestion that I would start with, which is that what does it mean for government to think in systems is starting with how and in what uncomfortable ways are we actually an actor perpetuating some of the complex problems to which we're seeking to respond, to recognize that role. And part of that is that recognition from systems that everything at subsystems levels and microsystems levels, it's representative of what is happening in the whole. So the way that we can see even amongst government departments, disconnect, a lack of communication and relationship breakdown, all of those things are evidence of what's happening in the larger system. And so the emphasis is on working internally first and trying to repair some of those system relationships and dynamics, because that has that influencing effect across the rest of the system, to all of those external relationships that they're connected to, all of those that they're trying to work in partnership with. One of the most tangible examples that I've seen at a very pragmatic level is the requirements around funding and reporting and monitoring, and how a conceptual framework around working towards outcomes, for example, has been proposed and is in many ways required. And yet that working in relationship to work towards those outcomes, to understand how does a funding structure need to be in place to support that, to enable that, that capability building, that reimagining of what that looks like in order to operationalize that and to work with partners in order to bring that into the reality is often a bit of a gap. So I think I'm probably coming up to time. So I think that is my suggestion is for government to think in systems, it's actually about their own role, their own agency, the ways in which they have a role in perpetuating those complex problems that they're trying to respond to, and starting there internally, recognizing that that subsystem within government is representative of the larger whole. And if they can build capacity in shifting that and improving those relationships and dynamics, that's an enabling environment for that to happen on a much larger scale.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shauna. I'm now going to hand to Angie, who's going to speak about why it's important for government to think in systems. Angie.
He mihi mahana kia tata katoa, ngā hapu, ngā iwi, ngā whānui o te ao, nō reira tina koutou katoa. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and an acknowledgement of all the mahi that is happening around the world as we grapple with these really very challenging circumstances. I just want to note that in terms of the video that we've just seen, it's a very interesting video, and I just want to note that the social contract for Indigenous people has been problematic and strained since colonisation. So for Indigenous people, this is an ongoing challenge. But I'd just like to pick up on what Shauna was saying around, I feel that my job as a social entrepreneur and in the development of an innovation methodology that holds system thinking is Indigenous knowledge led and holds relationships at the heart of our practice, is that my job is to figure out how I build the capability of the system I'm working in, of government, local government in my case, to be able to grapple with the complexity of the challenges that our families and communities are facing. And to understand the conditions that need to be grown inside of that system, one of the issues that is emerging strongly is how might we as government understand whether we're compounding or we are acknowledging the marginalisation or contributing to or alleviating the complex challenges that we have. And for us at the Southern Initiative, and indeed for Auckland Council, we think that some of the starting point with that is to reflect on our own system and how it's behaving and how it should be. And for us at the Southern Initiative, one of the things that we've been thinking about is how do we address the fundamental nature of a post-colonial system and construct that's characterised by all the things that Sean has talked about, a predisposition to rationalisation, compartmentalisation to silos, to embedding and reinforcing the status quo, to separation of power. And what we've developed is a way of conceptualising and redistributing power in places, spaces, processes, and power constructs to understand how we can rebalance. And some of that work for us has been around indigenising spaces and processes so that we can move beyond a traditional binary response inside a system and create the space and some alternatives for systems responses. We think that we need to build the systems empathy to focus on lived experience to drive system change, and that we need to encourage generosity and power sharing inside of the system. So when I talk about power sharing, thinking about how are we sharing power with our communities, with our citizens, with our families, and what we've been developing is a way to role model that within our system to build the capability of others to do that. Sharing power doesn't diminish your power, it makes you more powerful. Power is not finite, it can be shared, and it can be shared with our families and our communities and those that are most marginalised. So we've been thinking about what we need to do inside of the system. We know that everything is possible now because of COVID. The things that we were told the system couldn't do, couldn't change, that government couldn't do, the ways we couldn't change. We know now that it is possible. As well as working inside of the system, role modeling how to share power, disrupting inside of system to challenge the very nature of the post-colonial constructs and processes we've got. We're also working alongside our communities and our families and trying to understand how we recognise and support natural existing systems of innovation and support and responses, and how do we share control and power with those naturally occurring ecologies of support, cultural and social, and how do we redistribute resource to those, so that as well as the innovation, the systems innovation that needs to occur inside of some of our biggest power constructs, we're also enabling innovation that sits alongside those institutions or those constructs, so that now we've got systems innovation and Indigenous-led, community-led, family-centered innovation that becomes mutually reinforcing. I think that's about my time with it.
Thank you, Angie. Yes.
Tawna, you did a great job.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And a really, important and different perspective that you bring to the conversation, which is enormously valuable. Misha, as someone working right in the heart of government, the question that I wanted to ask you today was, what are the barriers that you confront and that government confronts in trying to think more systemically?
Thank you, Thea. A great question and wonderful to be here. I always love getting the black hat question. And despite it being black hat, I think there's a hope and there's a way, but I probably just want to quickly cover off on 4. And the first one is quite large, and it's around the machinery of government processes that we have. And these being primarily focused on outcomes. And what this means, I think, Thea mentioned that COVID has shown us that things are very interconnected. Things that start in one particular system can affect the others. And when we actually work through new policy proposals, put up bids through budget in government, there is a strong focus on outcomes-based planning and outcomes-based practices. And I think the 2 challenges with this is, first, it can ignore some of the indirect benefits or impacts. For example, you might be putting up something related to the employment system, but these has benefits to welfare, the health, and a whole range of other systems. And by taking only a narrow view in terms of the outcomes that we're going to achieve and ignoring the rest, we may both ignore broader ripple effects, broader benefits to the other systems when we're thinking about what we invest in, but also ignore the risks or the perverse effects to the broader systems that play. I think the second issue with this one is that while concentrating on outcomes or overly focusing on outcomes, we can forget that systems are complex and adaptive and they change around us as we do things. If we only have our eyes on these longer term outcomes, we may not actually pick up on the feedback that happens throughout the years and actually learn about the system, how it's shifting, and adapt to that. The second thing I wanted to touch on is single points of accountability. And this is from top down, from a Westminster type of government to organizational structures to our individual performances in government agencies. Systems work, everyone's talked about, it's collaborative work. When we're driving whole of systems change, we need to be collaborative. And this can be difficult when you are driving change that spans multiple points of accountability. And accountability and silos, I should mention, are important in government, right? Without any of them, you would have chaos in there. But we do need mechanisms that can span across those silos, allow us to have conversations about whole systems that span multiple points of accountabilities, without people feeling worried about stepping on toes or not knowing how to do joint work towards the welfare of the broader system. The third part is, I think, when we intervene and try and create changes to systems, we often do this while thinking systems are static rather than adaptive. And I want to mention a concept called anti-fragility. And I think a lot of systems are anti-fragile, that meaning that with disruption and stresses, they actually get better. And what this means is, I think, is, we try and do 2 things when we intervene in systems. The first one is improve it. So we try and improve, say, the employment system. We need to consider levers that, put stresses in there that will help it adapt and become better. But we also need to consider what's making it fragile and start to remove those. On the flip side, the second thing that we often do with systems, try and degrade it. So take a system like the Black economy. And when we try and degrade a system, we often forget that just by putting in an intervention, the system will adapt and bounce back and might even get stronger. So instead, we need to actually think about how we make a system more fragile that we're trying to degrade before we intervene. And I think this is a challenge because in government, we're not taught to think this way. We don't have mechanisms to think this way or to have feedback to understand this. And finally, the fourth thing is a little bit more individual. And I think it's the concept of unlearning. You know, we often come to events like this and there's always so much excitement. We need, you know, people come to it and think we need to do more of this or more of that, learn new skills, do things differently. And I think, you know, the truth really is here that we also need to think less in other ways. We need to let go of certain assumptions, let go of certain mental models that might be unuseful. We don't often talk about that process of unlearning, and it can be quite an uncomfortable and confronting process to go through as individuals or as organizations. So I guess they're a very quick four. I know there's many others. And while it was a bit of a black hat, I think, you know, this year has shown us that we can do things differently. We have pioneered those new visions for government, achieved things that we didn't think we could do. So I think we really are at the tipping point. And if we do work together, we will be able to help lead government to be what it should be. And I know Ray and Sam will have thoughts to offer to help us see that brighter vision forward. Thanks, Thea.
Thanks so much, Misha. And I'm sure everyone agrees that it's just so wonderful to have, you know, voices right in the centre of some of our biggest agencies who are advocating for these conversations to be had and for these new ways of thinking. So, yeah, very grateful to have you, Misha. Ray, I'm going to hand to you now to talk specifically about COVID and what the COVID pandemic has revealed about thinking in systems.
Thank you, Thea, and can I say how much I'm enjoying being invited into this really strategically important conversation. It's one I've been trying to foster for a longer period of time. So I'd like to thank you for the invite to being here. Good morning, everyone. Well, talking about COVID in a global sense is a big task. The COVID pandemic has revealed how poor organisations and governments are at engaging with and responding to situations that historically others have framed in the past as wicked, messes, complex, uncertain, VUCA, etc. The list goes on. So this is by and large, a classic case of situational framing failure. And we should remind ourselves about this conversation. And I think this is a point Shauna picked up on. Are we talking about government, or are we talking about governance, in which government is only one part and contributes to more effective governance? So that is in itself a framing question. And of course, too often people resort to complicated framings rather than complex, and are stuck in historical framings that the institutions we've developed historically frame for us, and we tend to take these for granted. Now, what else is happening here? There's a failure in human systemic sensibility of us humans thinking and acting relationally. There's a failure in systems literacy, appreciating the theoretical and methodological opportunities that can be gained from understanding systems, cybernetics, systems design, complexity, intellectual traditions, and of systems thinking and practice capability, of putting literacy into action that is effective in a given situation. So a systems literate observer would look around the globe and note some of the following phenomena. The sensitivity to initial starting conditions. What happened in Wuhan put the globe on a particular trajectory. Was it the trajectory we should have been on or not? Time will tell. Early border closings operated effectively in some nations, New Zealand in particular, to some extent Australia. And so this is an implementation of a closed system model where you're trying to break global connectivity of relationship, of contact between carriers of a virus. It's also revealed misplaced theory, herd immunity, for example, and contestations over models, Sweden versus others. We've failed to really take home the essence of critical connectivity, particularly around nursing homes, which have revealed neoliberal and privatisation, casualisation of the workforce issues. It's revealed inadequate feedback processes, and that's underpinned a failure by and large of some of our monitoring and control actions, resort sometimes to simplistic technology like apps, and I would also argue a too much over endowment in the belief that a simple technology like a vaccine is going to save us, rather than focusing on a range of other technologies that might enhance feedback processes and what I would call self-organised control. There's been a failure of co-design. The National Cabinet in Australia was an interesting and really important early attempt at co-design of governance arrangements, but has not flourished over time. There's too much dualistic thinking, particularly equating a virus and its biology with an economy, these are fundamentally different domains, and they hide in their conflation a crisis of human purpose and how we value and understand humans. And associated with that are inadequate understandings of how we enact and do control. Our actions have led to the emergence of vulnerabilities in our systems, which are often linked to cultural and political blind spots. And there's a widespread extent of what I call structural determinism of us being stuck in historical structures which have failed to be adaptable to our current circumstances. There are, of course, exceptions to all of these things that I'm saying in terms of systemic failure. Taiwan and New Zealand, and to some extent Australia, have done reasonably well, but some of that has been more by accident than design. So just to summarise and to finish up, there's been a failure really to be able to create effective and efficacious systems, to design systems that are fit for contemporary circumstances. And in summary, I would say this, we could frame the whole set of circumstances as widespread 4S praxis failure. What do I mean by 4S? Well, not being open to the situation and the framing of a situation, not engaging systemically, relationally, dynamically, being seduced by the systematic as opposed to systemic thinking, where systematic thinking is linear cause and effect, old-fashioned thinking, and a failure to practice, to invent, to design, manage purposeful systems that are relevant to an unfolding and dynamic world.
Thank you so much, Ray. We're going to move to our last thought leader now, Sam. Sam's going to speak to the question of what change we might expect to see in the world if governments thought more systemically. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Thea. Thank you for welcoming me into this group as well. And I'm calling in from Wurundjeri land out in the Yarra Ranges today. So I actually wanted to start very quickly with just a little activity rather than speaking. So if it's safe for you to do so, I'd just invite you to close your eyes for a second. I'd like you to try and imagine a tree that you know. It could be a tree from childhood, one from the local park, one from your backyard. I'd like you to try and imagine the animals or insects that might visit it. Where else do those animals and insects go? Where do they live? What do they feed on? What other animals or insects might they interact with during the day? Cool, you can open your eyes again. This is what systems practice feels like to me. It's the curiosity, seeing the unseen relationships, the unseen patterns in a system. The warm data, as Nora Bateson might call it. We need to apply these same simple approaches to the social and environmental systems that we work on in our work, to the systems we design and to the funding decisions we make, the organizations we work in. We need to embrace the complexity and work with it instead of trying to control it. I feel like that came through really strongly in everyone else's everyone else's talk about the importance of understanding complexity as a shaper of everything that we do. It's the context that we're swimming in. And once we understand emergence as the adaptive changes in a system, we move from trying to control the system to trying to influence it. So I think a great example of this is the societal response to COVID. We've realized that, you know, we can, in Victoria, obviously we had a lockdown. A percentage of people are going to abide by those rules that we put in place for our system. We try to make it as closed system as possible, but obviously we don't control everyone's behavior. People can do what they want to some extent, even if it requires them to end up with a fine. So it begs the question whether we should move our dominant response from planning-based approaches, which I would characterize as kind of an analyzing to predict what's going to happen, to experimentation-based responses, which really are about prototyping to learn and adapt. So I think, you know, taking that back into the COVID response was really interesting. In Victoria, you know, everyone was demanding the roadmap, the plan, the written down piece of thinking that told us how it was going to, how we were going to manage this. But what we actually found is that we had to adapt that roadmap. It very, very quickly became out of date, even though it was only a 2 or 3 month roadmap. Because we had to evolve to the social context. We had to evolve to the numbers and to what was actually happening on the ground rather than what we'd written in our plan. So I think one of those big things that we're going to see if we are thinking more in systems and acting more as we are part of a system, we're going to see more trying to influence the outcomes rather than controlling them. And I think that can lead, hopefully, to more joined up thinking, more collective learning, and better funding structures. Funding seems to be another thing that's popped up in a lot of the discussions before. So thinking in systems implies that we see the interrelationships and accept that there might be outcomes which are shared across the system. So for example, taking COVID again, reducing COVID transmission has benefits across the health sector, across the education sector, across the employment sector, and even across the environmental sector that I work in now, as in less single-use waste. So this is typically not how funding structures work. They don't fund these cross-governmental outcomes, cross-sectoral outcomes. You know, speaking from a non-profit perspective, you tend to get funded, in our case, we might get funded for environmental work, such as increasing biodiversity through regeneration work. But the outcomes of our work, the other outcomes of the work are ignored. So the benefits to physical health, the benefits to mental health, the benefits to community cohesion, social capital building, we're not funded for those. Those aren't acknowledged values that we create in those particular funding pools. So these binaries in the funding can drive that systematic approach rather than the systemic approach. And they very often drive the lack of joined up thinking, the lack of mutual value that we could actually, the greater value that we could be driving as across government and across the not-for-profit sector. As a counterpoint to that, I would say there's a project we've been working on called Sea to Source, which has kind of turned that approach upside down because of COVID. So normally our Sea to Source was going to be about beach cleanups and getting out there and tackling ocean litter, but the COVID has sort of turned that upside down so that we actually explored the challenges. We assessed various angles of people's motivations, how they might bridge action from their current lives and their current situation in lockdown, and then designed a series of offline and online activities through which they could take actions, get educated, build momentum in their local communities. And we've been able to do that because of this disruption to the way the funding system worked. So I think my key takeaways are just that sense of understanding and trying to see the unseen patterns, and working with emergence rather than trying to control the outcomes. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sam. So we're going to move to breakout rooms in just a moment, but that was a lot to take in, a lot of wisdom, a lot of stuff to think about. So I'm just going to give you a minute to pause and reflect on what you've just heard and gather your thoughts before we move you to breakout rooms. Well, again, just to remind you, we'll be asking you to think about, in order to think more systemically in government, drawing on the bits, the threads that you've just heard. What do we need to keep doing, believing, or being? What do we need to leave behind? And what do we need to start doing, believing, or being? I'm going to give you just a minute now to gather your thoughts. Okay, we're going to move into breakout rooms now. We're going to move into 5 rooms because there are 5 thought leaders who are going to be hosting the conversation. And just so that you know, in each room there'll also be a scribe from CPI who is going to be not speaking a lot but capturing the key takeaways into a Miro board, which we'll share after the event. We're not going to show it live. And I just want to reiterate as well the Chatham House rules, which means you can share what you hear, what comes out of the conversation, but you can't attribute anyone's name to what was said. So we're just going to move into breakout rooms now. Carmela, can you move us into breakout rooms? And each breakout room will explore these 3 questions of, in order to think more systemically in government, what do we need to keep doing, believing, or being? What do we need to leave behind? And what do we need to start doing, believing, or being? Okay, I can see everyone dropping back in, and I hope that everyone had fantastic conversations. We certainly did, and I'm really excited to share the board, the Miro board, which none of you can see yet, but we'll be sharing it via email afterwards, which is really full of incredible insights that are coming out of these conversations. So I'm going to hand now back to our thought leaders to just share maybe 1 or 2 key things from the conversation that really struck you. And I'd also invite everyone who was part of the conversation to jump into the chat now and to start reflecting on either things that you've heard today in the chat or in the from our thought leaders that have really resonated with you. So Sam, if it's okay, I'm going to start with you to just share 1 or 2 things that you heard in the chat. Maybe 1 thing actually, given where we are with time. 1 thing that you heard from the chat that really struck you as a key takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for everyone's input into that group as well. It was really interesting to hear from everyone. I've gotten a sort of an infinite loop of that says on one side funding is a driver and a limiter, and on the other side just says structures for collective learning. So I feel like those two elements were completely intertwined in the discussion in our group, and definitely feel like they're a big part of breaking down the sort of siloed culture that drives outcomes and also behaviour within and without government.
Fantastic, thank you, Sam. Angie, what the one thing that struck you from your conversation just now?
Well, kia ora whānau, thank you. Thank you to my group for the rich conversation. Linked to what Sam's just saying around the funding, we had a question around sort of how do we fundamentally rewire the machinery? And what we agreed on was that you still got to keep building capability inside of the system. And John says we just need Misha to keep talking to everybody and telling them about this stuff, which is probably true. So that needs to be happening, and we need to be investing and supporting our communities to design their own local fit for purpose solutions, despite government. I hope I did justice to that team, Hilda.
Don't worry, we've captured a lot more in the scribes have captured a lot more. So really, just I think the one takeaway from you is lovely. Shauna, your takeaway, please.
We ended on a really beautiful note. I have to look after the dogs. I'm so sorry.
Do you want me to go to someone else? I'll pass to someone else. We'll come back to you, Shauna. Ray, could you jump in while Shauna looks after her barking?
Yeah, happy to rescue Shauna. Can I start by apologising to my group and Jenny in particular, who I didn't get to enable to speak. Time just went, and my handling of the technology. There are many interesting points made by the speakers. We would have benefited from a longer conversation. The one I'm going to pull out, which is dear to my heart, is that of institutions and the issue of what historical institutions enable or constrain us doing, particularly in government, where government plays multiple roles. It may be funder, it may be regulator, it may be enabler, and often these purposes are conflated and end up in conflict. And that raises the question of how we engage in institutional design. So, for example, a new Public Service Act that creates demand for place-based initiative and systems thinking would be a great demand pull institution. And I guess the final point I would say is all institutions, i.e. norms, rules of the game, which we humans invent, are designs and experiments. A policy is always an experiment, yet we always think it can be implemented linearly and that there's no learning loop and feedback process about whether the policy actually affects what it's designed to do.
Fantastic, thank you, Ray. Shauna, are you ready to? Yes, great.
Two beautiful things I think we ended on. One that's for shared was that to give people permission. And what I really hear in that is that each individual, each actor in the system has a unique contribution that's to be made. And our opportunity to shift the things, to shift and change our systems is dependent on our capacity to be open to all of those unique contributions. And alongside of that is our building of relationships and sitting in and with and learning from diverse perspectives, divergent views, and understanding how to sit in relationship with that is part of the enabling factor for us to be able to offer those unique contributions towards the change.
Thank you, Shauna. And finally, Misha, your reflections, please.
Thank you, Thea, and thanks, speakers. There was so much, and what I really reflected on was that we had conversations around as an individual, as organizations, as institutions and government, and across globally, what did we need to keep, let go of, leave behind, and start doing. But the thing I wanted to touch on, maybe slightly different, was the fact that this type of government change while it is starting, it takes a long time and it is intergenerational. So how do we start to build systemic ways of thinking very early on into our future generations, so this type of conversation can actually amplify as we go ahead? So thinking about our education systems, and I think this is something really, really important, because we know one of the barriers for all of us is the way we've been educated, the way we've been taught to think, over time. And so this is, I think, something so important that if we can change that, hopefully that makes it easier for governments in the future to be able to build that momentum and change. Thanks, Thea.
Thank you, Misha. I think that's a wonderful note to end on. And I really hope that, obviously we were only able to scratch the surface today, but my hope is that for the people who have attended this conversation and been part of this conversation, that you walk away feeling empowered and emboldened to start to take some of these ideas and start applying them in your own work. And what we've just heard is that there are different levels at which this work needs to happen. There's stuff we can do at the personal level, at the relational level. There's stuff that we can start thinking about at the institutional level now. And then, as Misha just touched on, there's sort of longer term change around how we start to educate differently and think differently and tell different stories. I saw someone talking about storytelling in the chat, which is that sort of that much longer term view of how we drive this change forward. So I hope everyone has enjoyed this conversation as much as I have today. And just a few quick thank yous from me. I want to thank the CPI team who have worked behind the scenes tirelessly to bring this event together. And this is just one of 3 events that CPI is hosting as part of the Government After the Shock series. And particularly, I want to call out Bridget, who's leading all of the events across the team, the CPI teams, Carmela, who's been our tech whiz today, and Elisa, Paul and Katie, who have supported as scribes. I want to say a huge thank you to our thought leaders who have, contributed their time and thoughts and energy today and done a lot of things. They've said they were asked to say a lot in a little bit of time and also host conversations, which is not an easy thing to do. So a huge thank you to all of you for being part of today's conversation and making it possible. And then finally, I want to thank our audience. It's so exciting for me to see the level of interest and excitement and passion around this conversation in Australia and New Zealand. And it certainly makes me feel excited about what the future holds for government in this part of the world. So wishing everyone a wonderful day, and thanks again for coming.